Okay, so I've just started the recording just so that everybody knows this is going to allow us to hopefully be able to share this with people who weren't able to make it here tonight. So I just want to start by welcoming everybody to Art After Dark, Sci-Fi and Pop Culture in the Art of Terry Graff. So we're just going to begin this evening by just reading a land acknowledgement for the land in which the art gallery resides. So the Art Gallery of Sudbury, Galerie d'Art de Sudbury, respectfully acknowledges that we are located on the traditional lands of the Atikomishing and Anishinaabe, and that the large area we consider Greater Sudbury also exists within and adjacent to the territorial lands of the Wahnapitae First Nation and the Sagamok Anishinaabe. We honor, recognize, and respect these Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the lands which we share today. So thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Kaylee Vercruzen. I am the Digital Exhibitions and Operations Project Assistant here at the gallery. I first joined the gallery team back in May of 2022. I'm not from Sudbury. Instead, I find myself transplanted here after spending 2010 to 2021 in various university programs throughout Quebec, Ontario, and in the United States. And during that time, I studied English literature as well as art history quite extensively. And that's kind of where you'll see my interest in this talk really come out. When preparing for the installation for the current exhibition, Terry Graff Avian Cyborgs, I took the time to read through the exhibition catalog as well as any other resources that I was able to get my hands on that were related to Terry and his art practice. And I wanted to prepare myself kind of as best I could to not only participate in the installation of this exhibition, which contains nearly 400 works of art, but also so that I could talk kind of openly with the artist himself. Very excitingly, we were able to have Terry Graff join us at the Art Gallery of Sudbury for a 10-day stay in which myself and Ali, our collections care and exhibitions coordinator, worked alongside Terry to prepare the exhibition. So during that time, I was really struck with what seemed to me to be these obvious connections with science fiction and horror themes, as well as numerous references to both literature and film. I brought up many of them in conversations with Terry over his stay, and he was always excited and willing to share stories from his past that had influenced these creations of these various artworks. And kind of out of this, Art After Dark was born. So we're going to start now just by kind of going through an overview of the installation photos of the exhibition, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who Terry Graff is. So Terry Graff was born on November 12, 1954 in Cambridge, which was formerly known as Galt, Ontario. An artist from a young age, Terry's mother was encouraging of his proclivity for the arts, signing him up for various art classes and programs in their community, most of which were intended for adults and all of which Terry succeeded in. Young Graff was captivated by the expanding science fiction and horror genres. Horror comedy films such as Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, as well as A Bucket of Blood were kind of amongst his favorites. So beyond an appreciation for film, Graff actually read various science fiction literature novels throughout his high school career, igniting his teenage imagination with themes of technological innovations and futuristic worlds. In particular, he was inspired by Daphne du Maurier's short story, The Birds, which in turn actually inspired the film by the same name, produced and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. And it holds a particular impression on the mind of Graff. One of the lines from the film, in fact, shares a similar sentiment to that of Graff. So in the film, Mrs. Bundy says to Miss Daniels, quote, "Birds have been on this planet since the archetype. Miss Daniels, 120 million years ago. Doesn't it seem odd that they'd wait until this time right now to start a war against humanity?" So beyond the inclusion of birds in his works, it is the themes of environmental disaster, as well as references to fighter planes and battle-oriented language that have all made their way into Graff's oeuvre in both his Warbirds series, as well as his pandemic horror series. So this exhibition began at Cape Breton University Art Gallery in April of 2023 before it arrived at the Art Gallery of Sudbury this past September. In the new year, Terry Graff's avian cyborgs are going to move on to the Woodstock Art Gallery, where they will be on view from February until June of 2024, before those avian cyborgs are going to finally fly home to the East Coast, where they'll be on display at the University of New Brunswick Art Center from September to October of 2024. So one of the earliest iterations of Terry's mechanical ducks is actually currently hanging in Gallery 1, and that's Quack in a Box. You can see it in the image in the upper right-hand corner. It's on the far left. It was made in 1974 during his time at Fanshawe College. So this and the title piece, which appears on the orange wall, Ornithontronics from 1979, make up some of the earliest iterations of the cyborgs. So as well as being a lifelong artist, Terry has pursued an extensive education as well as a career in museums and galleries in various parts of Canada. His career began with an education at Fanshawe College of Applied Arts and Technology in London, Ontario, where he enrolled in a 3-year fine arts program. This was only the beginning of his pursuit of education. Graff went on to accept a position at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht in the Netherlands, which allowed him to travel Europe with his wife, who he actually eloped with in order to bring her with him. And they spent most of their time there visiting and exploring many art museums and galleries across Europe. So upon his return to Canada, Graff earned a Bachelor of Arts in Fine Arts from the University of Guelph, a Bachelor of Education in Visual Arts from the University of Western Ontario, as well as taking advanced courses in a variety of subjects at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. Graff also possesses a postgraduate diploma in Fine Arts, a Master's of Arts, and a Master's of Arts in Art Education from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So to nobody's surprise, Terry Graff is a very well-spoken individual who is able to share his thoughts through his art in a very clearly codified manner. It was around the 1970s and 80s that Graff's kind of signature duck machine works were born. Not unlike that of Mary Shelley's Victor Frankenstein, who turned to the craft that he excelled at in order to create his humanoid creature, Terry Graff has turned to art and created his avian cyborgs. A part of the baby boomer generation, Graff was born into a world which he describes as being a media environment dominated by television and electronic technologies. He states that he has at times been accused of focusing on the darker side of life, although he thinks that there are kind of an equal dose of humor and whimsy found throughout his work. And this is definitely prevalent in the works that we're going to be exploring in greater detail shortly. So as the exhibition's photos make clear, the Warbirds series actually takes up the majority of the exhibition. That long Warbirds wall alone contains over 200 artworks from the series. And there is an immense kind of sensory overload upon entering the gallery to view all of the works and to see the walls just covered almost floor to ceiling. In 2020, Terry, like many of us, found his work shifting and reacting with our new reality as the COVID-19 pandemic settled in. And speaking on this shift in his work, Terry states, quote, "Spooked by daily media reports of trucks filled with corpses and body bags and patients coughing up blood, hooked up to the breathing tubes and dying alone in overcrowded hospitals, I was compelled to interpret its emotional and psychological impact through the metaphorical visual language of horror films and Gothic fiction," end quote. So within the pandemic horror series are several touchstone references beyond just Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. References also include Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven and his The Masque of the Red Death, which is a short story that tells the tale of an outbreak of a deadly disease that kills off half the population, while serving as a cautionary tale about kind of class differences and the morality of human behavior and the inevitability of death, which is definitely, thoughts and themes that are very close to our hearts today. So before we continue, I want to give a little bit of a further explanation into a key factor in discussing Graff's artworks, which is the question of what a cyborg is. This was a question I had on my mind going into this exhibition. I knew the title of it, and I searched everywhere to try to find an example of Terry actually defining it. And thankfully, in an interview on CBC Listening, Graff defined a cyborg as, quote, a life form whose physical abilities are extended beyond normal limitations by mechanical and or electronic elements built into its body. This very physical description of the cyborg definitely corroborates with the depiction of Graff's avian cyborgs. But inspired by one of my own favorite examples of science fiction, I couldn't help but think of Star Trek The Next Generation's episode, The Measure of Man. So for the non-Trekkie fans here today, this episode is in the second season of the show. It's episode 9. And it shares this storyline after which, kind of pulling into Starbase 173 for some routine maintenance, a cyberneticist by the name of Commander Bruce Maddox, he's in the blue in the image on the left, wants to make an attempt at transferring the contents of the, quote, positronic brain of the Starfleet crew's very own Lieutenant Commander Data in the image on the right. And kind of what ensues is this trial to determine whether or not Data, being an android or a machine, is ultimately allowing him to lose his kind of autonomy. So Captain Jean-Luc Picard, also in the left in the red, he famously defends Data in an actual court setting in the episode. And he defends him against Maddox by pointing out that Data has actually met 2 of the 3 criteria for which sentience is defined by Maddox, which include intelligence and self-awareness. And after proving that Data had met these criteria, he poignantly asks him, so what if he meets the 3rd, consciousness? And I had that line of what if he meets the 3rd, consciousness, ringing in my head, listening to Graff's definition of what a cyborg is. And it really had me wondering if in this science fiction, horror, and dystopian reality that Terry Graff has created for his warbirds, if they were in fact self-aware. So I asked Terry this very question: would you say that your bird machines are only advanced in the physical sense, or do they also develop a sentience when they transform? Essentially, are the birds in your artworks aware that they are at war? So Terry responded with the following. He said, I think of my avian cyborgs as being intelligent, as being sentient beings. But I think of birds themselves as sentient beings. I see my birds as having personalities. Each one is different. I think of movement and I think of sound as I'm making my works. And I kind of talk to the birds and they talk to me as I'm making them. I think the birds then take on a character. Some look like they've been beaten and downtrodden, and a number of my early decoys, I actually burnt them in a furnace and pulled them out just in time to get the patina that I wanted. I nail and I scrape, and I put them through a trial by fire on purpose to give them a history. You know, life is hard, and I wanted that kind of difficulty of going through something traumatic. I wanted that embodied in the birds themselves. What does that feel like? Because that is what we all go through. So during my studying of Terry's artworks, I noted that beyond breaking them down into categories of film or literary references, that there were actually three different ways in which the science fiction and horror and pop culture elements appear in the works themselves. The first is visually. So this could be through forms of direct copies of visual images, such as this example here, the use of Shelley Duvall's iconic scream in Terry's painting Insurrection from 2021. In the 1980 horror film, The Shining is obviously where this iconic image comes from. It's based on Stephen King's 1977 novel of the same name, and it's kind of a hard visual stamp to miss, as it's one of the most iconic scenes in the horror drama. So the second type of reference is a titular reference. These are a little bit more subtle, and they're definitely harder to catch in the current exhibition, as Terry had asked for there to be no labels to accompany his works, which honestly a little personally thankful for, as it would have been hard to put up almost 400 labels on the wall amongst all the artworks. But many of the works in the current exhibition are direct references, such as that of Brave New World, which he painted in 2020. This is an obvious reference to the classic dystopian novel by Aldous Huxley, written in 1931, also titled Brave New World. And this novel is also a prime example of a cyborg future that Graff's avian cyborgs could be inhabiting. It's a futuristic society where new citizens are born out of artificial wombs, and there's this prevailing societal belief in technology's ability to remedy all problems caused by war and disease. So the final type is a thematic reference. And an example of this is Body Snatcher #1, painted in 2021. So unlike the visual and titular references, these ones are a little less visually straightforward, although there can be similarities. So for this one, there are similarities throughout the movie posters from both 1956 and 1978 of the adaptations of the film, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but it's not as direct a visual copy as we saw with Shelley Duvall's Scream. So instead, we're kind of left wondering, looking at the artwork, about the implications of this monstrous virus creature sucking on the brain of an unsuspecting masked human. So now that we've covered a few quick examples of these references, I kind of want to go looking a little bit deeper into a couple of Terry's works where these science fiction and horror themes are undeniably present. So the first is Bird and Coronavirus #6, which was painted in 2020. This was one of the first artworks by Terry that I saw, which to me undeniably had a reference to science fiction. So I'm going to try to make this a little bit interactive. So I actually have polls for you guys to participate in. So I'm going to launch the first one now. So the question is I want you guys to try to tell me, it's multiple choice, no final grade, no pass fail or anything like that. Just take a stab at guessing what this particular painting has referenced. All right, so we're going to end our first poll, and everybody has guessed that it is Ridley Scott's Alien. And you are absolutely correct in that. So this 1979 science fiction and horror film, directed by Ridley Scott and written by Dan O'Bannon, is absolutely the reference here. Graff's painting showcases this partially decomposed bird laying on a gurney with white blankets and a green virus escaping from inside its body cavity, and its wings and its legs are outstretched in this uncomfortable and almost unnatural position. And we also see a small stream of blood kind of dripping down onto the white sheet, and the bird is surrounded by this kind of dark and speckled background. And in Scott's film, we see from this still here, John Hurt, who plays Executive Officer Kane, he becomes the host for the alien, and taken over by the life form, the small creature, during this kind of group dinner, bursts forth from his chest before eventually killing him and escaping into the ship. And I'm sure most of you have seen this iconic film. But in the same way, we see these kind of blood dripping down onto his white shirt, like we did from the bird onto the white sheets of the gurney. And his arms are also similarly kind of wrenched and mimicked in Graff's painting. So this visual theme of horror is very prevalent throughout Graff's pandemic horror series in particular. Speaking on how he kind of diverted from his warbirds into the pandemic series, Graff states that shifting from making paintings about the terror and traumas of war to making paintings about the horrors of the pandemic were quite seamless, as he noticed military rhetoric, war metaphors, and the like were all being used by politicians, journalists, and even the general public to describe the challenges posed by the invading coronavirus, which incidentally to him also resembles a naval mine. So Graff, turning to his artworks, and in particular the horror genre, to process and to explore his feelings from during the pandemic is a popular theme because it's also seen in the ways that science fiction and horror genres are actually in the past have used the same kind of methods in order to process various questions of morality and the human condition. Okay, so we're going to go on to our next example. So I chose this image actually as the primary image for our event for a few reasons. This example is from science fiction history, and it represents a pretty iconic moment. The image is of a famous scream queen, and she's displayed brightly on a drive-in theater screen, directing her iconic reaction towards a large red virus. And most of the image, it's filled with the dark, almost velvety blacks and blues, and the cars are parked watching the movie along the foreground at the bottom. And there's this large black raven, a pretty key identifier as the identifier for the work as being a part of the pandemic horror series. It's appearing in the top right-hand corner. So we're going to start our next poll. So this piece titled COVID-a-thon From Dusk Till Dawn, which classic sci-fi thriller film do we think is referenced here? I personally think these questions get a little trickier as we go along, so I'm enjoying the fact that we're seeing a multitude of different answers. Oh, we've almost got a 50-50 split. Okay. So we're going to end the poll again, and I'll share the results with everybody. So the answer is, in fact, it came from outer space, not Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, although at first I thought that was the answer too before I started getting a chance to research into this. So It Came from Outer Space is a 1953 science fiction and horror film. It was the first 3D film actually to be produced by Universal Studios. Produced by William Alland and directed by Jack Arnold. It starred Richard Carlson, Barbara Rush, and of course, Kathleen Hughes, who is the star of our painting as well. Based on an original film treatment by Ray Bradbury, known mostly for his novel Fahrenheit 451. The plot of It Came from Outer Space tells this story of an amateur astronomer who witnesses this large object crash landing into the desert where he and his fiance have been stargazing. And you can see them kind of holding each other in the center of that image. What ensues is this kind of really traditional story of nobody believing this outlandish tale that this astronomer is telling him, everybody thinks, oh, he's got his head stuck up in the stars. But he's trying to tell them that it was a spaceship. He saw it. But what happens is the aliens kind of escape from the ship and they're kidnapping kind of victims from throughout town and making themselves look like these people so that they can wander around town and collect the materials that they need in order to repair their spaceship and leave. And the premise is that they're just so horrific looking that humans are not prepared for visually meeting them just yet. So what's interesting about this reference in particular is that it's actually not a still from the film itself. Instead, it is a reference to Kathleen Hughes, so seen here, and her small role in the film. She'd been brought in for special testing with their new three-dimensional camera. As I mentioned, this was brand new technology at the time. And they'd asked her to come in and to walk a catwalk wearing nothing but a bathing suit. And she had stated in an interview that she was invited to do so because she had quite the three-dimensional figure. So this footage of her walking on the catwalk ultimately is actually used to show over her name in the credit line at the end of the film as well. So after completing the testing for the camera, she asked to read the script and then insisted that she be given a role no matter the size in the film. And they were a little bit hesitant to do so because she had just starred in another film and they'd already cast all of the primary roles in this one. But she didn't care the size of the role, and she didn't care that Jane was such a minor character. She just wanted to participate in this kind of historic moment in film technology. So on screen for just a few short minutes, it was her recent fame that meant that she could be included in the series of promotional photo shoots for the movie. And it was from these photo shoots and ad stills that came what has been referred to as the photo that won't die. Although Kathleen Hughes herself has been quoted saying that she does hope that this photo never dies. She was guided by the photographer to throw up her hands and scream, an action that has nothing to do with her role in the movie. This iconic photo, however, stuck with her after that. Hughes has used the image as her headshot at various conventions, such as since the release of It Came from Outer Space. The image has also appeared in advertising campaigns across North America, notably to advertise such items as a hummus so good that it'll make you scream, as well as appearing on birthday cards in Canada. I did search and couldn't find examples of these, but they sound kind of iconic. She'd heard about the birthday card actually from her cousin who called her up to let her know what was happening. And one such other use of her image was actually put a stop to by her husband, who was screenwriter and producer Stanley Rubin, when the image was used on a condom wrapper. He was less okay with that. She thought it was very funny, but that use of her image definitely ended. So needless to say, this particular image of Kathleen Hughes is a very iconic one in classic science fiction and horror circles. And it's really helped visually represent her in her role as kind of this classic scream queen. So we're going to move on to our next examples, which are actually two images that we're going to share together. So it's two separate artworks, but they're both direct references to the same famous piece of literature. And I'm gonna prelude this with, this is probably going to be one of the hardest ones to guess. So I've let you guys know the titles of these like ahead of time. They are direct quotes from the piece of literature. So we're gonna launch our poll here and see what you guys are going to guess is the referenced work for both of these. Okay. So we're going to, we got an extra vote this round. That's exciting. Hey, 9 out of 9. There we go. All right. So we're going to end our poll. And I'm going to share the results with you guys so you can see what everybody else said. So naturally, the titles of both of these works are lines from William Shakespeare's Macbeth. So we're going to continue on here. So one of Shakespeare's most famous tragedies, the horrors that unfold in Macbeth are kind of it's this play that's filled with these like murderous moments. A whole war starts, it's deceit and revenge. And it has all of these same themes that modern horror stories look into. So, for those of you who haven't read it or don't remember the plot from when you were in high school English class, the story of Macbeth opens with three witches, also known as the Weird Sisters, and they're telling the Scottish general that he is going to be the king of Scotland, and that's Macbeth. This is, in fact, a lie. But he's encouraged by his wife, Lady Macbeth, and he kills the king and prepares to take over the throne. However, he's kind of struck with this paranoia and he just continues to kill more and more people to try to prevent the throne from being taken from him. A civil war eventually kind of erupts, and in an attempt to overthrow the murderous king, it ultimately results in the death of Macbeth himself. So obviously it's a little bit of a play on words. Terry used fowl as in the bird, but the line, it appears in Act 1, Scene 1, lines 12 to 13 of the play, and it reads, "Fair is foul and fouls is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air." This is spoken by the witches or the Weird Sisters themselves. It's the last line of the first scene, and these words summon Macbeth into the fate of his own story. And kind of simply put, what it means is what's foul for a witch is fair for a man, and vice versa. However, this turns out to be a paradox, which predicts the ultimate demise of Macbeth himself. And Macbeth actually speaks a similar turn of phrase just a few scenes later in Act 1, Scene 3, line 39, when he states, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." So in Terry's 2015 painting, Fair is Foul and Foul is Fair, the artist has portrayed a mechanized duck with wheels instead of feet and a missile perched on its back. The work seems to suggest a similar reversals for man and bird as there were for man and witch in Macbeth. War, which is foul for mankind, has been taken on as more of a power move for our feathered foe. So the second artwork is titled, "I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked," which is just honestly a lot of fun to say. It's a second literary example, obviously, that can be found within the Warbirds wall in Gallery 2. It was painted in 2017, and here we have another avian cyborg with its bony toes kind of sprawled out to fill out the wheels that have replaced his feet. And his eye is this kind of bull's eye, and he's got a missile on his back, and he's bent over, suggesting that he's moving forward, almost rushing into war quite quickly. And that's a motion that's emphasized by those black dust clouds emitted from between his tired feet. On his chest, the warbird carries a couple of circular badges in the form of a star and one with a large number 9 in it. So much nearer the end of the famous poet's play, Macbeth finds himself refusing to accept the fate of everything that has come upon him. And in Act 5, Scene 3, he declares, "I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked. Give me my armor." And this scene is particularly interesting as a reference for Graff to make, as it not only looks towards Macbeth's ultimate death in battle, but also it has a high degree of bird-related imagery referenced throughout the scene. So just a few moments earlier, following a monologue by Macbeth, who is reiterating for himself and the audience that he cannot be killed by just anyone, since the witches prophesied that he couldn't be killed by anybody who was woman born. A servant enters and Macbeth greets him saying, "The devil damn thee back, thou cream-faced loon. Where goest thou that goose look?" The servant begins to kind of reply saying, "Well, there's 10,000," before ultimately being interrupted by Macbeth, who actually cries out, "Geese, villain!" So when I discovered this, I laughed quite a bit actually at just in such a short period of time, the amount of birds being brought up. And typically in literature, it's been known to use birds as references to beauty and to freedom and to wisdom and the like, but it's also not uncommon for them to also be used to summon different representations of chaos as well as moral and physical destruction. So Shakespeare's Macbeth, as well as obviously Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds and Du Maurier's version as well, are just examples of the ways in which birds can be used to kind of summon this absolute chaos. So in a similar fashion to these storytelling geniuses, Graff has turned to birds in his artwork as these harbingers of war. So the final example that we're going to look at today is actually one of my favorite pieces that's on display right now. It's called The Imprint of War, and it's from 2019. So we're going to give everybody a couple of seconds to try to figure out what is the literary reference in this final piece. We've got lots of guesses. Right. Give it a couple more seconds for that last vote to come in. All right, we're going to close the poll and we'll share the results with you guys. And of course, upon seeing this work, I immediately turned to Terry and told him that it reminded me of George Orwell's 1945 novel, Animal Farm. So in the novel, one of the pigs has this prophetic dream in which the animals of Manor Farm are going to free themselves from their servitude working for the humans and take over the farm to create equality among the animals. And this novel, it's a staple in most high school classrooms for its ability to bring up topics of class structures and the dangers of the naive working class, as well as the exploitation of animals by human beings, among other more political themes. And all of these are also present as themes within the imprint of war. So what I find most interesting about this artwork is, unlike the other paintings within Terry's Warbird series, the imprint of war does not depict hybrid creatures. There's no mechanized animals or cyborgs, ducks in this painting. Instead, we're presented with this mother duck leading her brood of 12 ducklings who work together to carry this missile on their backs. And above the feathered family, there's a large biohazardous sign in a fiery sky that mimics the rising sun. So in the tradition of George Orwell, Graff uses animals to satirize the human predicament and exposes issues of injustice, exploitation, and inequality in society. In Orwell's novel, despite overthrowing the human farmers and taking over the farm, equality is not reached as the pigs rise in power as the prevailing species on the farm. And ultimately, the book ends with pigs becoming indistinguishable from the men that they had worked so hard to overcome. So much like the non-pig animals on Orwell's Animal Farm, the young family of ducklings naively marches forward into battle. And unlike the cyborg warbirds that surround them in the exhibition, these ducks represent the underrepresented working class that make war possible. They may not be in battle themselves, but they are most definitely participating in the war. With that, I would like to end just with a couple of words, again, from the mouth of the artist himself. So Terry said, "No adaptation is permanent. The world is in continuous flux. The duck has not waddled, but has been thrust into the 20th century. A machine-oriented rather than biologically oriented world replete with spaceflight, television, artificial organs, and nuclear energy. Integrated with machine parts, it swims through the homogenizing liquid of contemporary nature, teetering precariously between chaos and control, and disillusion and rebirth. So I just want to thank you all for attending Art After Dark. It has been a pleasure to kind of share this very exciting amount of topics with you guys this evening. And yeah, I just want to, I guess, open the floor for any questions that you guys might have.
Feel free to type your questions in the chat or unmute
Yes.
yourselves and ask out loud. And actually, I'm going to kick it off. I have a question that I'm really wanting to know the answer to now. So, when Terry was in Sudbury, he said that his the layout of the exhibition, he wanted it to feel busy and overwhelming because often in his studio, he's consuming different types of media, watching movies, listening to the radio and stuff. If you were to create an avian cyborg that fit into Terry's world, what sci-fi movie or film do you think you would have as your inspiration?
Very interesting question. So I'm also somebody who kind of works with like a busy background happening. I'm not a person who can work in silence. I've always got music playing to kind of help my brain going. And obviously I've kind of exposed myself as a big Star Trek fan. I come by it quite naturally. I grew up in a Trekkie household. So honestly, I think I'd like to see any kind of artwork come out that references something from Star Trek. There's obviously a lot of media there to reference from, all the way from the original series through even to the new Picard series. And you know, Star Trek also does really obviously focus on a lot of those same kind of thematic, you know, complicated ideas of the human condition and like what it means to be human and what it means to be different in a very kind of approachable way. So I think it'd be really cool to see some sort of a Star Trek related artwork. So yeah.
And with almost 400 artworks comprising the show in total, I'm sure that there's some stuff that you left out. Are there any honorable mentions that you'd like to mention real quick before we finish up tonight?
Yeah, no, it was really hard actually to narrow it down to just a few. And I knew that timeline wise, if I had included even one more in detail, we weren't going to be able to get to it and do it justice. But yeah, so like obviously like on top of like Ridley Scott's Aliens, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, there's also a Ghostbusters reference in his COVID Busters #2. One of the more visually striking images that I ended up having to cut was actually his piece titled Great American Horror Story, which is a clear calling to the American Horror Story television show. Some of his sculptures kind of invocate this like idea from like Mad Max, especially like Fury Road, with these like animalistic and spiky kind of vehicles that are built out of scrap. Like a lot of his assemblages really kind of bring that to mind. More literary references include Emily Dickinson. He's got a piece called Hope is the Thing with Feathers. There's also some Virgil in there, lots of Trojan warbirds that show up, as well as some kind of like fairy tale-esque ideas with like Mother Goose being one. There's a couple of English proverbs that show up. So like it's literally an endless list of references almost. I managed to collect over 20 in total. And I'm sure that if I spent more time intimately looking at all almost 400 artworks, I could find even more. So yeah, no, he's astounding in kind of this wealth of visual references that he's created, and it really does show a little bit of behind the scenes of who he is as an individual and kind of what makes him tick. Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, I just want to again thank everybody for attending this evening. It has been an absolute pleasure to have all of you here, and I hope that you all have a wonderful Halloween weekend.